Chapter 5. Preparations for the Battle. The next morning at the inn, I had a nice breakfast of eggs, toast and preserves. I also had some of the best coffee I had ever tasted. The morning mist was just starting to lift as I set off for Frantice's cottage. She must have anticipated my arrival, for just as I lifted my hand to knock on the oak door, she opened it. "Have you braced yourself for a tale which will raise the hair in the back to your neck?" she asked. "I think I can stand it," I replied, as she led me to the kitchen where she had 2 steaming cups of tea and fresh muffins waiting. "So, tell me about the full moon." Fran took a sip of tea and began to tell the tale. It is not that it started at the full moon. It must have started weeks before. The witch that died was an evil witch. But keep in mind there are also good witches. The evil witch had sisters who were angry about her death. They called a conference among the evil group to plan revenge. They knew of the shield protecting the prince, now the king, and his dog Rolf. The only way to break the shield would be to get 13 witches to attack at the same instant. That is why they planned to do it on the night of the full moon. The king's uncle, the old wizard, was in Tibet, studying magic with the Dalai Lama, when he heard of the pending attack. He went to his friend the Dalai Lama and explained the situation, telling him he must leave immediately. The Dalai Lama, probably the most peaceful, loving being on the planet, assured him he would not be necessary. Besides, the wizard had much to learn. The Dalai Lama nodded his head and said, "Follow me." They went down a long hallway, lit only with candles on either side. As he proceeded, a haze formed around the Dalai Lama. Suddenly, his body separated so that there were 2 entities of the Dalai. "Do not be afraid. I exist in balance. There are 2 sides to my being. One is war, the other one is wisdom of peace. This solution consists of both sides, just as the yin balances the yang." The 2 ghost-like images of the Dalai Lama separated, each going to a burning candle, one on the left and one on the right. A small amount of wax was taken from the candles, and the dual images of the Dalai Lama continued down the hall. The dual images crossed left to right or right to left, and each went to a second candle. Reaching to the base of the wick where the molten wax pooled, he dipped the original wax balls into the hot fresh wax. The 2 images of the Dalai Lama returned to the center aisle and converged into one being again. The Dalai Lama held the small wax balls in his hands. He manipulated them deftly, pressing facets in the surface of each with his thumbnail. He did this until he had 58 facets in each ball. The Dalai again continued, walking down the aisle with the wizard beside him. Water dribbled from the ceiling, forming a small pool approximately 3 foot in diameter, in the exact center of the aisle. The Dalai held the wax balls out. A drop of water hit his right hand and then his left. Steam hissed as the water struck the wax. As an explanation, the Dalai said, "This water is known as the tears of the earth." The wizard looked in at the gobs of wax, but in their place were 2 shiny crystals with 58 facets covering each of their surfaces. On each facet was a miniature yin-yang symbol in black and white. "We will go to your nephew's home," said the Dalai. "It may be too late. It will take at least 10 days. "Or less than 10 minutes, smiled the Dalai. "I must know the location. May I touch my fingers to your temples?" "Yes." The Dalai placed his 4 fingers to the wizard's head while holding the crystals between his thumb and ring finger. Images floated in the wizard's mind. He saw the castle and he saw his nephew and family. The children were in bed with Rolf, sleeping near the door. "You have a nice family. We will go now." "How?" asked the wizard. "We go through the nexus. It's a crossing of time and distance." They continued down the long hallway, which ended with an intricately faceted window. Light from the window cast a moving rainbow of colors onto the floor. To either side of the window were incense sticks and burning candles. The Dalai took 1 incense stick from either side, lit them from the candles on the opposite sides of the window. He then placed the incense sticks into tiny holes in the floor stones. Smoke swirled in twin spirals throughout the multicolored beams of light coming through the window. "Let us go," said the Dali, as he reached for the wizard's hand. They stepped through the smoke in the hallway of the Potter place and into the children's bedroom, half a world away. Rolf was instantly awake and crouched in attack mode at the disturbance. When the Dalai Lama and wizard stepped fully into the room, Rolf sat down and offered the Dalai Lama his paw. The Dalai Lama patted his head and said, "Good boy, I have a treat for you." He held in his hand what looked like a treat, but in reality contained one of the crystals. Rolf ate it, then rolled over, coaxing for his belly to be rubbed. "Do you always have this effect on animals?" asked the wizard. "Well, they are creatures of the world as I am. We talked on a different level. Someday I will teach you," promised the Dalai Lama. "Where is the young man's sword?" "I'll get it," said the wizard. He went to the master bedroom and knocked on the door. When his nephew came to the door, he looked quizzically at his uncle as he wrapped a robe around himself. "Bring your sword and come to the children's room." "Is there a problem?" the king asked, suddenly awake. "No, we are trying to avoid one." They entered the room and the king was surprised to see another person there. "This is the Dalai Lama from Tibet," the wizard said in introduction. "Could you please place your sword point down so the hilt is straight up?" asked the Dalai. The king offered the sword to the Dalai, but he replied, "I do not touch weapons. When needed, I am a weapon." The king placed his sword point down on the stone and held it by the grip so that the hilt was up. The Dalai stared at the hilt, and a tiny spot opened and then grew to form a hollow cavity. Holding the crystal in his hand, he dropped it into the cavity at the base of the sword. Magically, the leather wrapping on a hilt's base healed over, as though it had never opened. "Your sword originally was made to kill. Now it can also heal. Literally, you have the power of life and death as you wield the sword. Use the power wisely. If you are attacked, let this sword's energy into your mind." The Dalai and the wizard turned and walked into the wall of the swirling smoke and disappeared. The king looked at his sword and could not discern any difference. The children remained asleep. Rolf lay on the foot of one bed. The king wondered if he had just experienced a waking dream. He returned to his bedroom. Meanwhile, the Dalai Lama and wizard stepped back into the hallway of the Potter place. The Dalai asked the wizard, "May I show you my summer home? I could go for a bowl of fresh fruit right now." "I would also like some fresh fruit, but it is not in season." "I am also fascinated by your magic," answered the wizard. "It is not magic. I only redirect the forces of nature. You will enjoy the fruit." With that, the two men stepped through the swirling smoke and stepped into Shangri-La. In the meantime, deep in the Black Forest, the witches planned their attack. Their priority was to enter the children's bedroom, kill Rolf, and having 13 of them attack him simultaneously with the wizard's fire, breaking the protection of the shield. Next, they would kidnap the children and take them deep into the Black Forest. Preparations were made and countermeasures in place. The battle would occur at midnight on the full moon. At that point, the story, Fran paused and asked if I wanted a cup of tea. I felt like I had just come out of a trance. Looking at the window, I saw the sun setting. I had lost a complete day transfixed by the story. "So, how did the battle go?" Fran just stared into her teacup. "Tomorrow I will tell of the battle." I returned to the inn. My dreams consisted on images of dragons, wizards and witches, warring in front of a benevolent monk holding a scale. Good night. T. Ruth de Stretchen. Chapter 6. The Battle. I was anxious about what happened almost 200 years ago. Logically, it cannot matter in the 21st century, or can it? Something told me that it not only mattered, but it would be critical information. I did not eat breakfast that morning and took my hot coffee in a foam cup so that I could drink it as I walked to Frantice's cottage. It was the dusk of morning, the twilight before sunrise. Maybe it was my imagination going a little wild, but I would swear the cottage seemed to materialize out of the morning mist as I approached. I knocked on a very solid oak door. It was answered by Fran, who invited me into the kitchen. Today I will tell you of the battle. Shortly before midnight, on the night of the full moon, 13 witches surrounded the castle and its sleeping occupants. They mounted their brooms and took flight, reaching the parapets at the stroke of midnight. In unison, all 13 drew their wands. Wizard's fire illuminated the entire castle as balls of fire streaked to the crenellations, blowing the stone apart. Even today, you can see the rubble from the stone ruins of the towers. They literally blew the top of the castle to pieces. They then broke through the window of the children's room. By that time, the king and queen had reached the youngsters. The queen shielded the 2 younger children with her body. The king held his sword ready, and Groff growled at his side. "Give us the children, and we will spare your lives," demanded the head witch. "Over my dead body," responded the king, filled with rage. "First, we will kill your dog," taunted the witch. The king shifted his sword slightly to give protection to Groff when it happened. To this day, we're not sure what happened. It had something to do with the balance that Dali had talked about. It also involved the crystals in the sword, and one Groff ate. The king knew 2 things. First, 13 witches linked could break any magic shield. Second, he can only handle 1 witch with a sword at one time. The king angled the sword so that the flat side of the blade and its silver sheen could simply deflect a blast from at least 1 witch. He made up his mind to fight to the death to defend his family. Nothing would stand in his way. The witches focused their energy pointed at Groff. Just as the power flowed through the 13 wands, the king's sword multiplied so that 13 swords blocked each blast of wizard's fire. Not only did it block the blasts, but it reflected them against the witch to the left of the one currently spewing fire. 12 swords floated in the air, forming a complete circle of defense, each controlled by the king, just as he controlled the one in his hand. Wizard's fire struck the silver blades, instead reflecting off into stone walls. 99% of it was absorbed by the swords, followed by a hiss of steam. 1% of the blasts were reflected by a tiny dimple on the flat side of the sword, next to the blood groove, the size of the Dali's crystal. This occurred with each of the identical swords. The reflected fire was only the size of a pin, as it came off each sword, striking each witch in her shoulder with wizard's fire. Each witch collapsed onto the stone floor. The most amazing thing also happened at that same instant. Groff was at his master's side in one instant, and then in the next instant, he had 12 copies of himself standing below the unsupported swords. As each one of the witches was felled by the wizard's fire, Groff and his 12 copies moved in unison unto each witch. Instead of attacking and ripping their throats out, Groff licked at the holes in the witch's shoulders. His saliva hissed with steam, but he continued. Instead of consuming the flesh of each witch, the fire hissed into nothingness. He continued to lick, and the wounds healed. As the king watched, the grimaces on each witch's face relaxed, and each countenance became peaceful. The circle of swords duplicated from its original dissolved with a twinkle of light, and were gone. Just as the swords disappeared, the duplicates of Rolf faded to almost nothing. Then, with a twinkle of light, they disappeared, leaving only the original Groff. Rolf licked the face of one witch, not with a tentative lick, but with a full-tongue slurp. She awoke with a start, looking at the dog. She grabbed his head with both hands and pulled him near. "Good dog," she said. "Good dog," she said as she scratched behind his ears. "Thank you." She then kissed him on his nose. Groff repeated this 12 more times with similar responses from each of the powerful sorceresses. The king did not know what had happened, so he kept his sword at the ready. The head witch stood up and smoothed her dress and straightened her hair. I do not know the magic you used, but from my standpoint it was like being thrown in a volcano and having every evil of my being burned clean, then being reanimated and emerging in a clear, cold mountain stream, fully refreshed. And I feel like I talk for all of us, have no ill for you or your family. As a matter of fact, I really should say we have no ill feeling for anyone anywhere. May we make amends for the damage we have done?" The king sheathed his sword, realizing something monumental had changed. Suddenly an oval mist appeared, and his uncle and a bald man wearing a brightly coloured robe stepped through. "This pair is excellent," said his uncle, completing a conversation. The wizard put down his basket of fruit and started by bowing to his nephew. "My lady, princess and princesses, and sorceresses, may I present the Dalai Lama, who's generously offered to share some fruit with us." The king asked, "Do you know what happened here tonight?" By means of an answer, the wizard bent over and petted Groff. "Good boy, you made a good choice." Looking at the mystified sorceresses, he continued, "These ladies follow the path that was vile. When they used wizard's fire to destroy, it was matched exactly in power by crystals and balanced. The fire was quenched by 2 drops of water from the tears of the earth. A purified fire stream was reflected against each sorceress. Each was placed on a knife edge of life and offered a choice of balancing the good of tomorrow against the evil they had done in the past. Each chose life. When they did, Groff had the choice to accept or reject their choice, based upon his feelings of their sincerity. If he had not licked their faces with saliva containing the tears of the earth water, they would have combusted to a pile of dust." "What is this, tears of the earth water?" asked the king. "A balance to all forms of violence from fire or water," answered the Dalai Lama. "Balance is the key." The wizard asked them to help balance the world. "The children go to school in Vienna. A friend of mine has a home in Vienna which you may use." The royal family went to Vienna. The wizard and the Dalai Lama returned to the Potter Palace with 13 sorceresses. The land was given to the people. I interjected, "And they lived happily ever after?" Fran shook her head from side to side. "Some did, some did not. This is a real part of the story that involves the dog in Johnstown you call the Morley Dog. I'll explain tomorrow." Chapter 7. The Image of Groff. The next day Fran continued. It was fall of the year when the people of the area felt unprotected and forgotten. The king visited occasionally with Groff. It was on one of these occasions that the sheep started to go missing. It turned out to be a thief from a neighboring town, not one of the mystical creations from deep in the Black Forest, but the people still wanted protection. It was the Grimm brothers who were called on to sculpt an image of Groff in wax. They did so in extreme detail. They then made molds of the figure, not ordinary molds, mind you, but the molds contain hairs from the grooming of Groff. When the metal was cast and the statue painted, it looked exactly like Groff. The statue was placed in a park near the center of the city. If there was danger to its citizens of the city, the statue would come to life. Sometimes he would come to life by itself without any apparent danger. It sounds like this is what has happened in the city of Johnstown. It is protected over by one of the figures cast from the magic molds. I think I now understand the love of a dog for its people transcended everything I said. Fran added, "And love is the most powerful of all magic." I left the cottage and went up the grade towards where the castle had once stood. I slipped on some rubble and fell, hitting my head and passing to unconsciousness. I woke to a dog licking my face to wake me. It looked amazingly like Groff. As I gathered my notes from where they had fallen all over the ground, I looked for the dog. He was trotting to Fran to C's cottage. As he approached, the cottage door opened and he went in. The cottage then dissolved into a mist that dispersed with a twinkle of light, leaving just a pristine meadow. So I end this tale by saying, fairies have tails, but so do dogs. Sincerely, T. Ruth the Stretching. This has been the Fairy Tale of the Morley Dog, written by Mike Dudek, performed by Fiona Sharma. Copyrights 2007 Mike Dudek.